Yeah, I think we have the testimony in a public forum of a Ukrainian official essentially telling us that he was assassinated because he was part of the negotiating team back in March and April, and appeared to be, in their view, a Russian collaborator. Because, as he points out, that the team went there with no intention whatsoever of negotiating for peace. They were interested in simply dragging things out to buy time for Ukrainian forces to fight the Russians.
Well, are these rogue negotiators that are interacting with the Russian government on their own, or are these people that were dispatched by President Zelensky?
No, well, they were sent by Zelensky, and then the whole thing, as you know, was subsequently suspended in Istanbul, and they dropped the pretense of being serious about negotiating a solution. But this man was identified early on, and then essentially shot and killed on the grounds that he was a Russian collaborator. Now, I don't necessarily think he was. There are a lot of people in Ukraine who have been accused of this sort of thing simply because they opened their mouths and suggested that a peaceful solution was desirable.
Have there been, or has there been, the resignation or the firing of late of people around President Zelensky in his cabinet and in his personal staff? And if so, what's behind that?
Well, someone who had worked in the defense ministry for Zelensky, was in the cabinet, resigned in the middle of the allegations of corruption. Surprise, surprise. There was also an allegation that I don't know if it was he and his family, but another cabinet member who had vacationed somewhere in the Mediterranean, or no, I guess it was actually Florida, somebody said, while the war was going on, which of course was bad form given the desperate straits that the Ukrainians face. He seems to have resigned. You had this man, Arestovich, who was the spinmeister or public affairs officer, media spokesman, defense ministry employee, who suddenly up and resigned, and then subsequently spoke and said he doubted seriously that the Ukrainians could ever win this war with Russia, and wondered whether or not it might actually survive the war. And then suddenly he, surprise, surprise, was blocked, and nothing further has been heard from him, though as far as we know, he has not yet been killed.
I would imagine he has a big target on his back, a former government spokesman who resigns and says we're going to lose.
I think it's probably a good thing he takes the heat off the rest of us who are on the death list.
I know they're after you, Colonel, because I've seen that stuff. I haven't gotten word that they're after me, but I trust if you hear that, you'll give me a heads up.
Well, if I'm still around, I will. Absolutely. If I suddenly disappear, you don't need any further confirmation.
All right, let's talk about the wish of President Zelensky and his military commander for tanks, and the absurd footsie that the Americans seem to be playing with the Germans over the tanks. Everybody wants these German tanks, and Joe Biden's getting in the middle of it. Do they know what the hell they're doing?
Well, I think it's pretty clear they don't. In fact, I think this is an important theme that we should address, because the mood in Washington has very definitely changed. The attitude of the Washington community, and that I'm talking about those people that are the leading senators, members of the House, cabinet officers, president, vice president. The mood of these people has clearly changed. I think they're sensing that this is a lost cause, that Ukraine is very definitely going to lose. And they're trying to figure out, how do we prolong the suffering? How do we prolong this fighting? They'll say publicly it's for the purpose of, quote unquote, harming Russia, which has been a complete fiasco and a disaster, because Russia, frankly, has not been harmed very much. Not at all, I would say, in substantive terms, economically, financially, otherwise. But I think that's part of it. The second thing is that they're now really goading the Europeans, the Germans in particular, into committing acts that, frankly, can be regarded legally anywhere in the world as acts of war against Russia. And I think the German government is sitting there saying, do we really want to supply heavy military equipment, tanks, artillery, all these things in great quantities to this war zone to help these Ukrainians fight the Russians? Are we not in fact, becoming co-belligerents. Now, you and I have talked before about this.
Yes.
I don't think there's any doubt about it. We are co-belligerents, but I think the Germans are now interested in putting the brakes on that. So Scholz put us in a difficult position because his representative at Ramstein last week at the conference for donors and allies that were willing to send things to Russia said that the only way the Germans would send any tanks, Leopard tanks, was if we sent M1s. Then we went through a series of comments from people in the Department of Defense, like this Mr. Colin Kahl, Assistant Secretary of Defense in OSD, who said, well, you know, the M1 is a gas guzzler, and it has extreme maintenance requirements. It's too complex for the Ukrainians. It won't help them. The Leopard's easier for them to use, and the Leopard would be better.
Now, you have agreed with that, haven't you?
Oh, well, I agree with it, but not for the reasons that Mr. Kahl said. I mean, we've known for 30 years that the gas turbine engine's a catastrophe, both for reasons of fuel usage, but also because of the intake of all the dirt and sand and nonsense on the ground. This is an engine designed for the use of a jet at 15,000 feet, not for use on the ground. So here we have this turbine engine that's supposed to power this tank up and send it at 50 or 60 miles an hour towards the enemy. The problem is that historically, that's not necessarily what you need from the tank. I mean, tank doesn't have to go 50 or 60 miles an hour. We don't need to cover all that ground again, but the bottom line is that the M1's got a lot of problems. There's no question about it. I don't think people wanted to see this employed for the fear that they would be embarrassed by its performance. Not the gun, not the crew, but the tank as a whole, for the reasons we mentioned. So now the tables have turned. In order to get the Germans to send tanks, apparently President Biden said, well, we'll send 10 M1s. And Mr. Scholz responded by saying, well, fine, then we'll send 10 Leopards. Now, this seems childish and stupid, but I think we need to understand what's really happening. Number one, people have no faith in Ukraine's ability to win this war. We have been lying about what's happening in Ukraine between the Russian and Ukrainian forces for months. We have been exaggerating Russian losses, exaggerating Russian problems, and minimizing and obviating Ukrainian problems and losses. The truth is seeping out. You can't conceal it much longer. So the first thing is they know they can't win. In other words, we're losing the proxy war. Our proxy can't win it. Secondly, the Europeans are concluding that this is dangerous. You know, how far out do we stick our necks? And they don't have the military industrial power to rapidly produce anything. And I think this is enormously important. The lead time, for instance, for the AMRAAM missile, which is a very important weapon that's used in the F-15, the F-22, the F-35, and by NASAMS, this, brilliant, what I would call it, brilliant air defense system that we and the Norwegians have put together with Kongsberg. It's excellent for shooting down cruise missiles, helicopters, so forth. The problem is that from the moment you ask for a missile, the wait time until you get it is 32 months.
Oh.
That's how long it takes to produce these things. When you look at all of the missiles that we're promising the Ukrainians and the systems, they're not going to arrive in any short period of time. Now, the Germans are talking about giving the Ukrainians air defense systems like the Patriot, and they'll probably provide them with some missiles. But you'll go through those missiles very rapidly, and you just can't replace them. So the Europeans and we do not have the surge capacity to fight a major war. We just don't have it. The Russians do. Their factories are operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Contrary to popular belief, they're not running out of anything. They've got more of what they need than they've ever had. So all of this is dangerous. That's what we're learning from the Europeans now in private.
You stated at the outset of this last statement you made that you have sensed from public sources, and I guess from the people with whom you communicate regularly, a change in attitude on the part of decision makers in Washington. Now, I would imagine that what you have sensed is below the radar, and it hasn't yet bubbled up into the public consciousness.
No.
I mean, maybe Joe Biden's a bad example, but a hawk like Lindsey Graham, you're not going to hear him saying tomorrow the Russians are going to win and we ought to get the hell out of there, even though he may be whispering that to your friends and colleagues in D.C.
Well, see, that's an important point because I don't think they're whispering that. See, this is the great danger that we face right now. A couple of historians contacted me and they insisted they talk to me. And they walked me through all of the things that FDR did as president in the 1930s to effectively goad the Japanese into attacking our forces in the Pacific.
Right.
And we all knew, I mean, contrary to popular beliefs, the Navy, the Army, Marshall, the CNO of the Navy, Stark, all these people knew that the Japanese could, in fact, attack and destroy Pearl Harbor. And in the run-up to the war, FDR did several things. He put out something called the McCullum Memorandum and directed the Navy to deliberately violate Japanese home waters.
Yes.
And they did it with warships again and again and again. And he was told by the CNO, we could lose some ships. He said 2 or 3 ships is okay if we have to lose that. I mean, this is incomprehensible today, but that's what he said. And ultimately, they told him what the implications were, and he said, continue to do it. Ultimately, we know what happens. He leaves the fleet deliberately in 1941 in June in Pearl Harbor. He does not return the fleet to San Diego and San Francisco, where normally in Puget Sound, that's where the fleet in the Pacific was quartered, not in Hawaii. And the CNO said, Mr. Roosevelt, Mr. President, we're targets.
We're sitting ducks.
We could lose the fleet. Ultimately, you know the rest of the story. He deliberately did this. There are a lot of other things. He was sending as many bombers as he could to China, to Claire Chennault and the Flying Tigers at the time. He wanted to build up an air force there that could firebomb Japan from China. This is in 1939, 40, 41. We don't talk about any of these things. And what they said is what is happening right now looks an awful lot like what FDR did. Now, I personally don't think that that's on President Biden's mind. But then again, I'm not sure President Biden is much more than the man who reads the script that's handed to him.
All right,
I don't know what the people behind him are up to, but if you look at what we're pushing, this is what brings you to the next point. The Ukrainians are going to face this onslaught. They have already said they can't withstand it. They're going to collapse. It's already beginning, and the Russians haven't even attacked in strength. What do we do then? Do we play this game of Polish forces, American forces, Romanian forces, whatever else we can get, and push some distance into Western Ukraine? Do we then play the confrontation?
I want to play the Russian side of this from Foreign Minister Lavrov 2 days ago in South Africa. Gary?
Мы говорим о том, что там происходит на Украине. Мы говорим о том, что эта война, она уже почти не гибридная, а почти настоящая, которую Запад долго готовил против России, стремясь уничтожить все русское от языка до культуры, что было на Украине столетиями, и запрещая людям говорить на...
Fair to say that he's speaking what President Putin thinks.
Yes.
Okay.
And I think not just President Putin, I think the majority of Russians. And it's a fair assessment based upon the things that we've been seeing over the last several years, unfortunately.
But this is a direct accusation by the internationally recognized foreign minister of Russia, pointing a finger at Washington, D.C. and the West as the prime motivators for this war. And then he uses this odd phrase, which you and I have discussed off air. He said, it's not a hybrid war, it's a war. What does he mean by hybrid war? What does this phrase mean?
This particular term was coined or invented by a former Marine major named Frank Hoffman. Very nice fellow. And I think it was really designed to somehow or another give the Marines justification for lots of Marine infantrymen to fight in future insurgencies. And what he was trying to talk about was today, hybrid war consists of men with rifles on the ground, media, external factors, other players in the international arena, game-changing weapons, all of this, instead of what we normally think of war as a more conventional confrontation with armies and air forces and so forth. And what what Lavrov said, let's throw this hybrid nonsense out. We're talking about a real war. He's talking about high-end conventional warfare. It's not talking about nuclear warfare, but high-end conventional warfare. That's everything up to, but not including nuclear weapons. And he's saying this is being planned against us. That's a fair conclusion on his part based upon what you see us doing, trying desperately to provide enough support to the Ukrainians. Remember, our support goes beyond technology, goes beyond weapon systems and ammunition. It's information warfare. We control the information highways. We are proselytizing for war against Russia. We are depicting Russia as this evil state, this nationalist state that rests on the foundation of Russian Orthodox Christianity. It protects its borders. It has an identity. Ergo, it must be destroyed. It must become like Western Europe and the United States, a country without borders, a country with identities that are being washed away in seas of illegal human trafficking, drug abuse, and so forth. That's what's at stake in their minds, and it's not an unreasonable assumption based upon what we're seeing. And he's saying, look, we're going to fight. And that's what we need to understand. They're not kidding, and we're not prepared for an all-out war. But Russia is.
Are the people in Washington who now are manifesting a change in mind aware of the defiance and forcefulness with which these kinds of statements out of the mouth of Mr. Lavrov have been made? And are they prepared to counter it by sitting down and talking to him? Do they think they're going to counter it militarily? And do they not realize that that's World War III if they do?
Well, first of all, I think it's very clear that under no circumstances are they going to hold talks with the Russians, because that would suggest that they've made a mistake.
Right. It would suggest that we're pulling the Zelensky strings, which of course we are.
Yeah. So it's not, I don't see us doing that. I was asked the other day by a journalist, what do you think we should do? I said, hold talks immediately without preconditions. We need to come to some sort of resolution no matter what. That in fact, was essentially what Kissinger said a few months ago, and then, of course, changed his tune. We're not going to do that. That's an admission of failure. No one in Washington ever admits that they failed at anything. Everything's a success, no matter how many times you fail. That's the first problem. I think the second problem is there's a lot of arrogance and self-delusion. I don't think the people on the Hill really understand what war means anymore. I mean, for many, many years, we had lots of interesting people on the Hill. Sam Nunn was a good example, but there were many others. Most of them had served in the military. A lot of them lived through the Second World War. They understood what you meant when you started talking about war. So when it came to Russia, or in those days, the Soviet Union, people made it very clear that's not what we want. Whatever we do, we must find a way around that, because we all know what that means. And they weren't necessarily saying it would be nuclear, but it would be so destructive and self-defeating, we don't want to engage in it. I don't sense that anymore.
What is your understanding of the latest numbers of military killed? Ukraine, Russia.
Well, Judge, first of all, this goes back to the fiction that we've been spinning about the war. We haven't told the truth about Ukrainian losses. It's becoming harder and harder to accept. We know from obituaries, we know from people on the ground in the hospitals treating the wounded. We know from the Ukrainians themselves who are posting things, comments on Telegram and sending videos. Ukrainians have lost easily 122,000, with absolute certainty, men killed on the battlefield. Secondly, they've admitted to roughly 35,000 missing in action, presumed dead. And if you go back to World War II and you look at German fatalities, there were almost 2 million casualties are dead, frankly, from the Second World War in Eastern Europe and the German Wehrmacht. And a substantial chunk of that, hundreds of thousands, were missing in action, presumed dead. They were never recovered. We have to understand that the majority of casualties being inflicted on the Ukrainians is a consequence of artillery fire, not just hard shell artillery, rocket fire, firing thermobaric warheads. These are the fuel air explosives that utterly destroy a whole area. This is how you avoid going into buildings where there may be people waiting for you. You fire a thermobaric warhead into the building, it eliminates the oxygen. It's destructive, but it kills everything because there's nothing to breathe. You have a whole range of these kinds of explosives. The Russians have great quantities of them. They use them very effectively because they are also linking these in real time to overhead surveillance. This is surveillance, reconnaissance, intelligence platforms. So you're getting within seconds sometimes, certainly within a minute or two, accurate data to the artillery systems that can then fire. Keep in mind that the Russians can fire up to roughly 60,000 rounds a day.
Mm.
Ukrainians are lucky to get off 6,000 or 7,000 rounds a day. In other words, tenfold more than the Ukrainians can fire in response.
Can you address the, you've indicated 122,000 dead, 35,000 unaccounted for, probably dead Ukrainian. What do your sources tell you is the number of dead or missing and unaccounted for on the Russian side?
What we're getting from the Russians, as well as from some the Ukrainian sources, are just, unfortunately, when it comes to the Russians, they're just not believable. But we are hearing from people on the battlefield, depending upon where you are and who you talk to, the Russians have had somewhere between 16, 17,000 and 25,000 killed, and perhaps another 25, 30, 40,000 wounded. And people say, well, how could that be? I just explained it to you. You have overmatch in firepower on a dramatic scale, on a strategic scale. That's why.
When will the globalists in Western Europe and in the State Department and the Defense Department come to the same realization that the political class in Washington has begun to achieve, that this is a losing fight and we have to change the mission?
Thus far, I haven't seen any evidence that there's any recognition of this. In fact, I continue to hear these disturbing comments that, well, if the Ukrainians have to fall back to the Polish border, then we'll fight a perpetual war against the Russians.
So this crazy president of Poland is going to send 100,000 Polish troops east over the border, and is going to beg Joe Biden to let the 101st Airborne join them?
Well, I don't think he has to beg. I think there are lots of people that would push for that. And remember, you've got at least the equivalent of 3 armor brigades from the United States on the ground in Poland and down in Romania, plus the 101st, plus other units, formations, artillery, and so forth. Then you have the Poles, as you point out. They've now mobilized at least 200,000. They're trying to build up a force of over 300,000. That would probably support the projection of somewhere between 60 and 100,000 troops on the ground. I don't know about the Romanian side, but I know that there are elections scheduled in Poland for the fall. I don't know exactly how the government thinks, but the Polish population, and this is very important. We also discussed this map of Europe that shows the various polling data, and what you get all across Europe from the publics is a very definite preference for a negotiated solution to this war as soon as possible. There is no evidence that anybody in Europe wants to go to war with Russia. And I'm beginning to see that happen in Poland, where more and more Poles are saying, wait a minute, we're literally on the edge of the abyss here. If this war spreads, we will be destroyed.
Doesn't the German public want inexpensive Russian natural gas back in their homes to heat them for the winter?
I'm sure some do, but not yet. I think there's this belief that somehow or another they can get past this tough winter and be ready next year with their alternative energy sources. This climate change business is more than a program. It's a religious faith in much of Europe, and particularly with the Germans and Scandinavians. It's quite strange. And real data don't make any difference anymore. Again, everything connected with this war is emotion.
All right. I'm going to assume, or I want you to assume, that everything you've just educated us on is known by Russian intel and is known by President Putin. Does he come in with this slam bang invasion of 300 to 500,000 soldiers and finish everything off, or does he let the Ukrainians just sort of die on the vine?
I think he knows that he can't do the latter because we will constantly try to resuscitate the corpse, no matter how bad it gets. We will rush in there, put it back on life support, try to get it back up on its feet and fight. I think he knows that the only way to rid Ukraine of this Ukrainian armed force is to go in and destroy it, and ultimately to replace his regime with something else or wait for something else to emerge. I don't think he feels anymore, or for that matter, any of the Russians, they can trust anything we say. They know they can no longer trust the Europeans. They used to trust the Germans, and they actually, I think, believed Macron at one point in time. Now they know they can't trust anybody. I don't see great enthusiasm for a long and destructive war in Ukraine. Why would they be enthusiastic about that? Why do they want to kill other Slavic Orthodox Christians? I don't think they do. But the point is they don't have much choice. And I think they will press ahead. The question is when. And I told you I thought that the major offensives would begin sometime between the 21st of January and the 7th of February. We'll see if I'm right. There are others that say, oh, no, they're going to wait until March. I don't know. But I think it's coming sooner rather than later because of the things that you're pointing out. You know, why should they sit around and wait for resuscitation again? Why not just go in and put this thing out of its misery? But it's not going to be a lightning blitzkrieg. That's all nonsense. Warfare has changed. They have over Ukraine this large umbrella of intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance assets, and then they have this wide range of strike assets. Everything from rocket artillery to jets to tactical ballistic missiles to long-range artillery. All of this is linked, and they're going to move their ground forces under this umbrella. They're not going to be surprised. Anything out there that looks like it could threaten their forces will be identified and struck quickly and put out of business as they move. So instead of this lightning blitzkrieg, it'll be a deliberate, methodical advance. It'll take a little longer, maybe a month, maybe 6 weeks, but it'll happen.
I know your field is military and not intel, but you have friends across the board. How long does it take to?
Well, it's interesting because they have not sustained those kinds of casualties in the past. For them to lose 1,000 a day in one day, it would be interesting to know what the cause is. Did they indicate at all what had caused these deaths?
No, it's one of those short, Colonel, it's one of those short summary articles. It's no more than 2 paragraphs. It's like it was written on the fly. Maybe more is to come. If something breaks during the show, we'll pick it up and let you know. You and I discussed a piece in the Financial Times based on writing by reporters who are all over Europe that NATO's stockpiles are getting low and needing urgent replenishment. How could that be?
Well, I think that's easily explained. First of all, even in the 1980s, when we were pouring enormous amounts of money into our military establishment, NATO was really conducting business as usual. Now, that was better than what we've seen since the early 1990s, but there was no sense of any imminent danger of war in Europe that justified massive production of equipment or munitions. Once the wall fell, so to say, you see that the German army was rapidly disbanded. The German government simply disarmed itself and fell into the hands of these combination of Greens and leftists who were convinced that that Fukuyama was right, that history had ended and there would be no further conflict.
So NATO, and you've been saying this, NATO is giving arms to Ukraine from its substance, not from its surplus, and its substance, whatever it may need for whatever purpose. The old days, the Russian bear, but whatever purpose, its substance is depleted significantly.
Oh, absolutely. And again, this reinforces another point, that the Europeans did not sign up for a war with Russia. When this whole business began, and I say business, I'm talking about going back to 2014 with the installation of the government that was essentially friendly to us, guided by people like Victoria Nuland and others from Washington. And then the subsequent massive buildup of the Ukrainian army designed effectively for one purpose, to attack Russia, specifically not just to attack Russia, but to regain control of Crimea. So this was an unambiguously offensive force aimed at Russia. I think the Europeans looked at this and said, well, this won't really go anywhere. The Russians really don't want to fight, and the Russians are no longer armed as they once were. And what we're discovering is that they were not entirely wrong, that the Russian military was hardly prepared for a major war, which is why they ultimately went to the pause, the strategic pause, the economy of force. And they went to a war footing. They're now on a war footing. Their factories are running 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. They're not in any danger of running out of ammunitions or equipment or anything else. And they're turning out excellent equipment, brand new equipment in many cases. It's arriving very rapidly at the front. They now have a very large force, and it's getting larger every day. So I think the Europeans just never signed on for this. And the problem we have right now is that we grossly miscalculated on, the Russians. We don't really understand them. We didn't pay any attention to them. We're staring strategic defeat in the face.
Have our supplies been depleted, and
Absolutely.
are they in need of replenishment, the Americans, to the same extent that NATO's are?
Well, of course, you got to remember that if you look at something like the Javelin, a friend of mine at Raytheon told me that, and this was ultimately posted by Fox News in one of the articles, but a friend at Raytheon said, look, we've gone through almost 7 years of production of Javelins in Ukraine. It takes time to build these missiles, whether it's HIMARS or Raytheon's other products like NASAMS and so forth. All of these missiles are very complex, high-tech weapons. We've gone through our stockpiles very quickly, and we have no surge capacity, none. And that's something people don't understand. But the Russians have managed to very rapidly surge production. And the Europeans are very concerned about it. That's why inside NATO, behind closed doors, people are saying, this can't go on. You've got to end this, Washington. Everyone's at risk. We have nothing left. In fact, the whole tank issue is blowing up in everybody's faces because the tanks are simply not showing up. Suddenly, other European members are reluctant to commit their Leopard tanks. And if I were sitting in their shoes right now, I would feel the same way. Why would I send my armor over there? I might, in their minds, they say, well, once Ukraine is destroyed, we have to be able to defend ourselves. And I think they're right.
To this argument, late last week, General Christopher Cavoli, I don't know if you know him, the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, an American general, was quoted as saying Ukraine's losses are, quote, out of proportion to NATO's expectations. Now, that's consistent with what you're saying, but I'm surprised to hear that from General Cavoli, unless this is the type of leak that's intended to acclimate the public to reality.
That could be. Cavoli is the Supreme Commander, Europe, and what he says is certainly going to have a huge impact in Europe. Most people in the United States won't pay any attention, but everybody in Europe will. And so in that sense, you could be right that he's signaling that this is not going to go on. We cannot sustain this. He's not going to come out and say it, but I think that's his message.
Would someone of General Cavoli's position, an American four-star, but commanding American and foreign troops to the extent that he's commanding them, you can tell me what that means, in Europe, have needed the permission of the State Department or the Defense Department or the West Wing to make a statement that profound?
Absolutely. It would have to have been vetted in the White House as well as with the Office of Secretary of Defense, and I suspect the Secretary of State.
He also used a phrase, and maybe this is military science 101, I don't know. Precision can beat mass. Can you tell us what that means?
Well, I did not necessarily use that.
No,
phrase.
You didn't use it. General Cavoli did.
Yeah. Cavoli is not wrong. What you need, though, is the following. Wars are won and have been won, certainly for the last century plus, by accurate, devastating firepower. Your ability to direct accurate, devastating firepower against the enemy at a place and time and space that makes his position hopeless. Let's put it that way. we have precision. Unfortunately for us, so do the Russians, so do the Chinese. This monopoly that we had for years on precision munitions is gone. Now, what the Russians are demonstrating is that they understand that you need both. You want precision munitions, precision missiles, precision rockets, but you want huge quantities of them if you're going to win. So Cavoli is trying to sort of be on both sides of the equation. He said, well, precision can beat mass, yes, under certain circumstances. But if your opponent has precision and mass, probably not. And that's the case with Russia right now.
Wow. You and I also talked about some of the behavior of Ukrainian agents and recruiting officials. I don't know if they're military or not, lowering the conscription age to 16. Now, everywhere in the world, a 16-year-old boy is a boy, not a man, not a fully developed man, and too young for the military, but I guess not too young for Ukraine. You and I shared a video. I don't know how old this kid was, 14 or 15, was literally kidnapped right in front of his mother's eyes and shoved into a military truck. They were just walking down the street. What is this going to do for the morale of the people in Ukraine? Is it common or is it isolated? And has the conscription age in Ukraine, this is almost child abuse, been lowered to 16?
My impression is yes, it has. And there are multiple sources confirming that this is the case. And there's lots of evidence being posted by Ukrainians all the time about the true situation. There are pictures of Ukrainian soldiers that are obviously, 15, 16 years of age. So there's no doubt that this is going on. But I think this is part of the larger picture. The Russians went into this economy of force, and they maximized the effectiveness of their connectivity between space-based and terrestrial-based ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, assets above, and gun systems, rocket systems, missile systems. They've inflicted terrible casualties. Whole year groups of Ukrainian men are dead and are gone, have been annihilated. And at the same time, you have this much smaller population from which to draw on, as I talked about previously. There aren't 37 million people in Ukraine anymore. The areas that Zelensky controls, there are perhaps 18, 19, 20, 21, 22 million, which is roughly the size of the population of the Netherlands. That population is mostly male, I'm told, because lots of old men, women, and children have left the country. But still, the men that are there are not all able. Some of them are at advanced age, and lots of them are children. And so they're in desperation turning to this. This regime is at the end. It really is. But it's not going to give up. It's going to fight to the bitter end, and it's going to sacrifice whatever it can to stay in power.
But when will Joe Biden and Tony Blinken and Lloyd Austin and Jake Sullivan, the people that presumably are making these decisions, recognize what you just said, that the regime is at the end?
I think that for all intents and purposes, that message was delivered weeks ago from the Department of Defense to the White House, and it was rejected. Period.
Well, they're rejecting reality in deference to their political needs. Well, we'll hear that in the State of the Union tonight.
Well, I'm sure you'll hear an entirely erroneous picture. I mean, someone asked me today, how did we end up like this? I said, well, we've had 40 years of Cold War, at the end of which the Soviet Union fell apart and we emerged, if not victorious, then certainly healthy and well, and we avoided global war, which was our goal for 40 years. In just 1 year, we faced defeat in Ukraine through this proxy war, but more important, we're on the threshold of a potential confrontation with Russia, something that we worked for decades to avoid. So I guess the answer to your question, Judge, is it doesn't look good. We're not going to admit failure. No one will say they were wrong.
The Russians love anniversaries. February 24th, of course, is the anniversary of the beginning of this military incursion. From your sources, Colonel, does President Putin have his hundreds of thousands of reinforcements ready to pour in to eastern Ukraine and begin marching and killing and destroying on their way west.
Yes, they're ready. That's why I thought that by now they would have already pulled the string, so to say, and have moved north. But the shaping attacks that have been going on down in southern Ukraine have essentially set the Russians up for multiple axes of advance from the south, up towards Zaporozhye, up through the Bakhmut area, and further east up along the border with Russia. I don't know which one they're going to take. Maybe they'll take them all, but that has worked. Why they have not already attacked, who knows? I mean, one thing I'm sure Sorovikin realizes and Gerasimov realizes is that their strategy of enticing the Ukrainians to attack them relentlessly has worked. Ukraine has been bled white. And they may be saying, well, there's no reason to rush. We can wait another 3 or 4 days. Let's wait for additional ammunition. Let's wait for additional whatever it might be. Remember, logistics is important. And they want to push forward ammunition, medical support, more firepower, all of those kinds of things. And it may be they want to push some more forward. But the truth is they could go right now, and there's not much to stop them from going straight north and on the eastern side all the way to Kiev.
Have you seen any evidence of demoralization amongst the Ukrainian troops because of their vast casualties?
Anecdotally, you go on Telegram and you look at the things that are being posted in Ukrainian by Ukrainians, and yes, there's plenty of evidence for it. There's no question about that. Also, the hatred and hostility is growing for Zelensky, as more and more Ukrainians are blaming.
Just let me stop you. Is this hatred from the public, Ukrainian public, from the military, or both?
Well, I'm talking primarily about soldiers in the field, but that may also apply to the population. I just don't have access to that in Western Ukraine. I don't know what they think there. But soldier-wise, oh, absolutely. And they're also looking at very corrupt leadership. You know, there are comments coming in all the time. You're stuffing your pockets with cash, you and the generals, your corrupt leaders, and we're dying, by the bushel every other day. I mean, assignment to Bakhmut for the last couple of months has been essentially a death warrant, and everybody knows it.
Not too long ago, maybe 3 or 4 days ago, the former foreign minister of Poland revealed that at one point the Polish government was thinking of, I don't know how they would do this physically, militarily, and legally, partitioning Ukraine and considering the western part of Ukraine, the part largely untouched by the war that includes the capital, Kyiv, as a Polish protectorate, and thereby triggering Article 5, the obligation of all of NATO to defend Poland, if that part of Ukraine, a la Polish protectorate, were attacked by Russia. I mean, this just sounds to me crazy. It almost sounds like the justification Hitler used to combine Austria to Germany to protect Austria, even though the only people Austria needed to be protected from was him.
Although most Austrians disagreed, and they were quite happy to join the German state. I think Hitler's a bad comparison. Okay. I think a better comparison would be somebody like Stalin, the man that murdered 16 times the number of people Hitler ever encountered. I think Poland is another state in the region with unfinished business. You've got to go all the way back to the First World War and understand the Second World War was an extension of the First, and then all of the people in the region that were formerly part of Austria-Hungary, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, even the German imperial state or Prussia, all these places fell under Russian domination, Russian communist domination, and everyone was unhappy with it. Everyone hates it, and everyone felt betrayed. The Poles in particular, once they got out from under Soviet occupation and control, always envisioned a time when they would regain their former stature in Europe as a great power. So these kinds of thoughts and strategies have been around forever. The problem is if they are seriously considering this, and they may be. I mean, it's hard for us to know, but nothing would surprise me. The polls are romantics to the bitter end. If they think that by moving into Ukraine and claiming that they are acting in the name of NATO and Washington, that'll be the end of NATO. The Europeans will say, you've had it, you're on your own. We're not bankrolling your war to regain your empire against Russia.
Well, we already know that the president of Poland has said his goal would be to claim back Crimea. Now, that is an impossibility, and it's insanity.
Yeah, but you mean Ukrainian president, right?
No, the Polish president.
Oh, he wants to recapture Crimea?
Yes. He wants American troops and his troops and Ukrainian troops to recapture Crimea. This is an impossibility, and I think you'd agree with me. It's insanity for him to say that.
Well, he's obviously on hallucinogenics of some kind that would make him billions of dollars if he could mass produce it. But no, I don't see any evidence for that happening. And again, look at everybody else involved. And I guess you have to make exceptions for people that live in northern Norway that think that might be great, who are on the edge of the West and are totally remote from reality. You may have some of those in England. I don't know. But everybody else on the continent of Europe will walk away from that. There's no chance of that. And that's the end of NATO. People just say, wait a minute. No, we're not joining this war on Russia. Russia is not the Soviet Union.
Is there any chance, no matter what Washington does, that Ukraine can win this war?
Well, of course.
Or that Putin can lose it?
No, of course not. No. Putin isn't going to lose anything. And so, somebody said, well, Putin is weakened and adrift. I said, you mean Joe Biden? They said, no, Putin. I said, no, Joe Biden, not Vladimir Putin. The Russians have a strategy. They know what they're doing. They're methodical. They're deliberate. They're effective. We don't. We never thought through the consequences of our actions. We're all sitting around here in Washington saying, oh, what do we do now? Ukrainians are going to lose. We can't have that. We've got to ship more over to them. What do we do? See, this has been my concern from day one, that then people who are rank amateurs are saying, well, we've got to do something. Maybe we can move into Western Ukraine, just out to Lvov, and set up a safe zone. I don't think it's going to go down very well with the Russians at this point. You can't tell your opponent, you must be humiliated. Your state must be dismembered, and your government must be destroyed. Then we will kindly accept your surrender and welcome you into the brotherhood of international globalism or something. But that's effectively what we've been saying. So if you're a Russian right now, you're looking at this and saying, we're just going to keep going until there's nobody left in Ukraine that opposes us. And I'm afraid that's the path they're on. And I don't see any evidence that we're going to try to seriously arrest it.
What will it take, in your mind, for Zelensky to call up Tony Blinken and say, let's start some back channel communications with the Russian foreign minister, because this can't go on much longer? Or is he not the type of rational person to do that? Or is Blinken not the type of person to accept that?
I think Blinken and the president would have to assure Zelensky that he and his inner circle will be flown immediately to Miami or Malibu or somewhere, and ensconced in wealthy homes and surroundings, and live comfortably for the rest of their lives, in which case he might do that. But otherwise, forget it.
All right. I want to switch gears just a little bit. Colonel, where on the planet is the largest gathering of Chinese intelligence agents outside of China?
Well, the largest concentration, let us say, of intelligence operation, in other words, the biggest operation outside of China,
yes,
with all of the technology and capability, is probably in Mexico. Probably on the outskirts of Mexico City.
And we obviously know at whom and at what those intelligence activities are aimed, if they're in Mexico.
And remember, the Soviet Union maintained its largest KGB operation in the world in Mexico, because Mexico was very friendly to the Soviets. I mean, these are old issues. Venezuela, Cuba, and Mexico were always pro-communist. They supported the communists in the Spanish Civil War. They supported the Soviets and the communists during the Second World War. They supported them ever since, off and on. So the bottom line is this is why this business about the balloon is so depressing. The balloon is not large enough to carry a serious payload that can communicate anything or collect anything. Somebody said, well, it's the size of 3 school buses. It has to be the size of the Goodyear blimp before you're going to put anything on it that makes any difference. And in the meantime, the Chinese have 300 satellites circling the globe. A third of those have military capability. And several of them constitute China's global positioning system that guides all the missiles and rockets and munitions that they have to their targets.
Do you think
every day, the Chinese satellite constellation monitors where every surface warfare ship in the United States Navy is located? That location information can be rapidly transformed into targeting data. I mean, this is serious. We need to know about it. They don't need a balloon. They have plenty of satellites that will read the names on gravestones in Arlington.
I mean, they
can monitor every conversation they want, including the one between you and me and Jill and Joe Biden.
I mean, they caused 90% of the country to be fixated on a balloon for 4 days. And
it certainly is reminiscent of the Cold War. During the Cold War, we frequently would pick up someone that we were convinced was a Soviet agent. Most of the time they were, but not always. And essentially use them as trading material so that someone that the Soviets had picked up could be freed in some sort of exchange. I don't know if that's the case this time around, but perhaps it is. But the thing to keep in mind is that this Wall Street Journal is very anti-Russian and extremely neoconservative in its outlook. It certainly doesn't bear any resemblance to the Wall Street Journal I grew up with. And as a result, they're not very sympathetic to the Wall Street Journal and its owners. And of course, the owner is Rupert Murdoch. And I don't know that anyone has said anything about it other than I think Tucker mentioned it on his program that this man had been apprehended. Now, he was a long, long way from Moscow. And I have no idea what he was doing. He was within striking distance of some Russian military installation. And theoretically, he was trying to write a story on what the impact was on Russia of the war and whether or not its industries were actually producing and so forth. Whatever was the case, he was picked up. And I don't think the Russians are going to be very sympathetic.
Do the Russians respect journalistic rights? Does he have some sort of immunity because he's a bona fide journalist for a bona fide American media outlet, albeit one that is anti-Russian?
Well, you can be a bona fide Russian journalist with all the right credentials. And if you are seen photographing or visiting Virginia, say in the vicinity of Norfolk, and we are in a state of war, I think we would pick the man up. See, the thing that has to be brought in mind is the Russians are at war. And under those circumstances, it's very foolish to go near any military installation. And that's why I say if we were at war and we saw people nosing around submarine pens up in Puget Sound or a large Air Force base in Florida, we would pick them up right away.
So Jack Devine, and we'll run a clip from him a little later on, says that the Central Intelligence Agency does not use American journalists to do its dirty work, only foreign journalists. Is it inconceivable that Mr. Hershkowitz was working for American intelligence?
I simply don't know. What I do know is that he would probably willingly turn over any information he found to the CIA because he's very hostile to Russia, just as the CIA is doing everything in its power to keep this operation going in any way, shape, or form it can. It's trying to shape domestic opinion. We know that. It creates the narratives that are widespread inside the United States on everything right now connected to Russia. So does he work for them? In theory, no. Does that make any difference under the circumstances? Again, Russia is at war. This is an American journalist. He is somewhere close to or en route to a Russian military installation. He's going to get picked up.
Got it. What is the status of all of the tanks that everybody was all agog about a month or so ago, the German Leopards and the American Abrams. Have they arrived? Are they on their way there? What is the likelihood that they will tip the scales ever so slightly in favor of the Ukrainians?
Well, as far as I know, the numbers of American M1 series tanks have not arrived. That I don't know when they're going to show up, but they're certainly in the process of being readied for, use by the Ukrainians. The Leopards have shown up, as have some of the other pieces of equipment, and of course the Bradleys. They're not really tanks. That's an armored fighting vehicle, but it does have a 25 millimeter chain gun on it that's very lethal. I don't know if they also are going to equip them with TOW missiles. That's also a lethal missile under the right circumstances. I think what people are discovering is that the Russians have a number of missiles. One of them is called the Coronet. And this Coronet missile can be fired from 5,000 meters away or potentially even further. It's self-guiding. Once you sight the target, you can essentially fire and forget it. And if that warhead reaches a tank, any tank, it will destroy the tank. It doesn't make any difference what it is. So that that is something that I guess people are now beginning to notice, because the Coronet missiles were used against Leopard tanks in Syria. And people should be very concerned about that. Again, this is something I think other analysts have said. It's not an individual weapon system. It's not the arrival of 200 tanks or 500 tanks that are going to make any difference. It's the integration of various types of equipment, tanks, armored fighting vehicles, various missile carriers, air defense, air and missile defense. For instance, there's a 30 millimeter automatic cannon linked to radar that's excellent, that's produced by Rheinmetall. I would say you'd probably need a couple of hundred of them on the battlefield just to protect yourself from all the various unmanned aerial systems. So the bottom line is, no, this isn't going to change anything.
Do the tanks have some sort of a weaponry or equipment in their skin, for lack of a better word, a lay phrase, to neutralize the weaponry that attacks them?
Well, they have what you would call active versus passive defense. An active defense system can be all sorts of things. It can be small explosives embedded in ceramic and metal tile that is applied on the outside of the tank's armor. There are different kinds of this thing. You actually can put radar on the tank itself that detects an incoming missile. All of this stuff exists. The problem is twofold. First of all, most of that active equipment only works once. In other words, once you've struck the tank once, you don't have that protection anymore. In other words, you get a direct hit.
Right.
If you strike it twice, you may get something more, but then you're essentially naked. It only gets you through a couple of initial fights. Okay. Secondly, we don't have anything right now to deal with what I would call top attack. In other words, a missile that comes in and strikes on top of the turret. This has been a threat for a long time. In other words, it comes in and it dives down on the top of the turret where the armor is thin. The Israelis are looking at a number of very innovative ways to change that can be integrated into future armored fighting vehicles.
Do the Russians have missiles that will do that?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. By the way, so do the Germans. And they have not released any of those. We've been working on those, and I think we have some, if they're not already fielded in the U.S. military, and they may or may not be, I don't know. They certainly are in development. These are the new threats that are changing the nature of warfare. This is what effectively robs you of your mobility on the battlefield. And it robs you of your ability to use all of this armor that historically we've relied on to come to terms with the enemy, to go right in and kill the enemy at close range. It's not going to be solved quickly. It's sort of like World War I, when suddenly people discovered machine guns, artillery, and mines, and barbed wire and trenches, and the maneuver stopped. We're in a similar conundrum. It won't last forever, and we're going to have to find a way through it. But the bottom line is we're not really prepared for it.
The head of the Wagner Group has proclaimed that Bakhmut has fallen. President Zelensky has not refuted that. It seems to me, as a layperson in the military world, 10,000 miles away, that it's safe to say that Bakhmut has fallen. Do you have any intel on this?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, Prigozhin made a number of interesting remarks.
That's the head of the Wagner Group.
Of the Wagner Group, right. And Prigozhin said something that many of us have suspected was the case for months, but now we've had it from the horse's mouth, and I think it's probably true. And that is that Surovikin, the general that was brought in the early fall, late summer last year to change the command structure and the way the Russians were operating,
right,
decided to turn Bakhmut into what it became, a bloodbath, a meat grinder. So they were deliberately leaving Bakhmut partially surrounded, and in the hopes that more and more and more Ukrainian forces would be poured into it that could be systematically destroyed. That's the way it looked to me for a long time.
And is that the way it worked out?
Yes, absolutely. It's been brilliant for the Russians. This is the best thing that could have possibly happened to them. And one of the things that people don't understand is, well, why didn't they just cut this off and be done with it? Why aren't they doing that? Well, there's a reason. Because if your enemy comes to you, and I just described the battlefield that we're on now, which is not very favorable or friendly to large maneuver forces. So you have to infiltrate into this World War I setting. If that's what you're operating on, you're just doing what your enemy wants you to do. And I think Surovikin was the man behind that. And that's effectively what Prigozhin said. Now, they say that all but a few blocks, something like 11% of the sort of built up area of Bakhmut is absolutely devoid of Ukrainians, but there's still some left on the edge. And you still have talk, as we talked about the last time when we put the map up, you still have talks of 80,000 troops breaking through in or around or near Bakhmut in some fashion. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, but there's still a lot of talk about that. So perhaps you leave the door open one more month and let more people, essentially convert themselves into corpses by going in there.
We just interviewed Jack Devine just about a half an hour ago, and he had some comments about the Russians in Bakhmut that either will affect your blood pressure or cause you to have some fun with him. Here's what he said.
In the last 2 months, you were telling me these great wizards of the war were saying the Russians have the 300,000 man army and they're going to roll right over Ukraine. Here we are, 150,000 troops went in, and they may or may not have taken a town. I mean, he is having a hard time. This is not victory. Anybody that thinks he's won something, God bless you. But I mean, I don't know how I could hold my head and invade a country and move a few kilometers, So I think he's in trouble. I think he's in serious trouble. That's why there's a fight between the regular military and the Wagner Group.
He, of course, to whom he refers is President Putin.
Well, Judge, what do you want me to say? I think Jack is entertaining to listen to, but I think he's got a severe problem with cranial rectal defilade. Thanks, Jack, for your interest in national defense. The other thing I would say is, and this is something else that people aren't paying attention to, but they should right now, the bridges over the Dnieper up at Zaporizhia and further north. These are major bridges that you can drive, 18-wheelers, tanks, anything you want across these bridges over that river. They're all intact. And the Russian citizenry has asked several times, why don't you destroy these and stop those Ukrainians from crossing that river? Well, the Ukrainians aren't crossing the river in very great strength anymore because they've killed most of them. They're trying to put together this big counterattack. We'll see what comes of it. I have serious doubts that it's going to amount to much. I think it's just going to get a lot of people killed. So why haven't they destroyed those bridges, Judge? Is it Jack Devine's perception that, the Russians just aren't very bright? They haven't done their battlefield assessment. They're not acting. Well, I don't agree with that. I think the Russians plan to use those bridges
themselves. I mean, what prompted the ridiculous comments from Jack was my inquiry about Bakhmut falling. And first he denied it, and then he said he had heard the rumors that it fell, and then he said it's just one little town. Well, you and I and the thousands that watch us when you're on this show looked at the map and saw how central and how critical that town is. And now you've told us that the Russian strategy has not only been to secure the town, but to use it as the jaws of death, if I may, for the Ukrainian troops that were foolish enough to be flooded into those jaws.
Well, Ukrainian commanders, we know, have begged Zelensky to let them get out. They described it exactly as it is, a meat grinder. They were just losing people. We've been through these discussions. The average lifespan for someone new to the front is what, 4 hours? This is insane. So I think the Ukrainians knew that. The larger issue, and I Jack is basically giving you the standard narrative, and that's fine.
Right.
And everybody's doing that in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post. Every once in a while, a little bit of truth creeps in. But the bottom line is that no one is moving a lot anywhere until the mud goes away. And you try to explain to Americans that this stuff is like slogging your way through 10 feet of slime that sticks everything, that stops everything. Americans can't even begin to imagine it. The only place I've seen in the United States where you come close to it is in southern Texas, where you have something they call caliche. It's a real thick earth that becomes mud and does something similar. But even it pales before what we're dealing with in.
Is this unique to Ukraine? And is this possibly what makes the Ukraine earth, dirt, so fertile for growing wheat?
No, I think so. I think when you're talking about what 10 to 15 meters deep in most places, this black earth that's very rich that will grow anything. Right. Throw anything in it, it grows.
When the Ukrainian military superiors are foolish enough to send their troops into a meat grinder or the jaws of death, does American intel know about this, even military intel? And are they warned about it? Or do the Ukrainians do it anyway because of this vain effort to die fighting?
Well, now you're moving into an area where we just don't know. I mean, I'm sure some of your former intelligence officers that you've spoken to can give you a better picture. My experience is that, first of all, if you've already decided what the outcome is going to be, which is the case in Washington, that Russia is going to be defeated, humiliated, and driven east out of Ukraine forever and ultimately capitulate and give up Crimea, if you believe that, then a whole lot of things don't work well. And one of those is that you may just ignore what comes up to you that doesn't conform to your preconceived ideas. That's always been a problem. We went through that in Vietnam for years.
This morning in Moscow, President Putin addressed publicly the new U.S. ambassador to Moscow. There were other Western ambassadors there as well. And he basically blamed the war on the United States and articulated in public his view, a view you and I share, and most people watching us now share, I think, that the U.S. was responsible for the coup in Ukraine in 2014, the so-called color revolution. And the U.S. started all of this and thus is largely responsible for it. I don't know that President Putin has been that direct, that public about this before.
Well, I think he certainly made the larger case. He hasn't been specific about the so-called coup, but there's a huge mountain of evidence to support what he's saying. And by the way, you now have Mr. Netanyahu in Israel, who is absolutely convinced that we're running a quote-unquote color revolution against him and his government.
Well, you're a question ahead of me as to whether, God bless you, Colonel, whether you believe that the Central Intelligence Agency was responsible for massive, persistent, endless demonstrations in the streets in Jerusalem and Israel over the makeup of the Israeli judiciary.
Well, you have this thing called the National Endowment for Democracy that is all over the place. And the National Endowment for Democracy should probably be renamed Color Revolution Headquarters for the subversion and installation of new governments that are subservient to, responsive to U.S. will. I mean, that was clearly going on in Kazakhstan in the first few weeks of this Ukrainian disaster. You'll recall the Russians sent a lot of special forces in there to help the government recover itself. It's been the case in any number of places. I think that's one of the reasons that Lukashenko has effectively signed on 100% for Putin, because you had the same outfit working in Minsk.
Right.
This is not new. Now, is the CIA involved with that? Of course.
Right. How else could it have happened? Well, President Putin was speaking directly into the eyes of the American ambassador in Moscow. President Zelensky was visiting one of his staunchest allies in Poland. We have a little clip there. There's the president of Poland, and there's President Zelensky. What more can the Poles give him short of troops on the ground, which we know is what he wants?
Well, now we've got another problem in the region. All of these, well, I shouldn't say all, but most of the states in Central East Europe that border Russia or are close to it in any way have agendas. We've got to remember that Poland, after World War I, regained much of its territory that it had lost in the 1790s. It would like to do the same thing again. Remember that Stalin's great gift to the Europeans was to shove millions of Germans further west, then shove millions of Poles into places that were historically German, at least for 1,000 years. And this had a wonderful effect because it forced the Germans away from Russia, but it also created in Stalin's mind permanent conditions of hostility between the Germans and the Poles for the territorial changes that he imposed on them.
Right.
Hungary lost vast territory at the end of the Second World War. The Kingdom of Hungary was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Right.
They controlled vast lands that are now occupied by the Romanians. Some are occupied by the Serbs. Some are occupied today by Croats. Some are occupied by Slovaks. So you go back into these countries and you begin to talk to people, and just because you lost a war, just because you weren't on the winning side 100 years ago, you have to understand these people. They were dominant powers for centuries, dominant not just in economic or military terms, but also culturally, linguistically. You get the same thing when you go to Iran. Very few people understand that from the Chinese border all the way to the border with Russia and Ukraine, the language that was spoken on the so-called Silk Road was Persian.
All right. Well, while we're talking about cultural, are there cultural rumblings now in Kosovo?
Yes. Yeah, that's another terrible wound. It's another example of where we intervened. We created an artificial construct that was forced into existence that otherwise would never have been tolerated in the region. Remember,
Yugoslavia?
Yeah. Well, remember that Yugoslavia fell apart. That too was inevitable because the majority of people that were Roman Catholics or Muslim certainly did not want to live under Orthodox Christian Serbs. That's another gift from World War I. It was a dumb idea. We're going to force people that have been either allied or ruled by Catholic Germans for 1,000 years into the arms of Christian Orthodox Serbs. It's crazy. Well, we did it. So that fell apart. And then we decided, well, all of these people must be compelled to live together in the new multicultural, multinational, multi whatever it is, paradise that we in Washington are creating. And the whole world will learn this is the way it must be. Well, this is all nonsense. Kosovo is part of Serbia and has been part of Serbia for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. They lost it a couple of times and they regained it. And they fought very hard during the Balkan Wars to get it away from the Ottoman Turks. If you're Greek, if you're a Bulgarian, if you're Romanian, if you are Serbian, the presence of large Muslim populations that were essentially created by the Turks and separate governments and institutions that were installed by the Turks, they're very uncomfortable with this. And given what we experienced in 2001, you can imagine the paranoia flag went to full mast. It's still there. So Islamist terrorism, Islamist uh, assassination programs, gangsterism, call it what you will, is run out of Kosovo to a large extent. It's a clearinghouse. A lot of those missing weapons from Ukraine show up in Kosovo and end up going to North Africa, down into the Arabian Peninsula, somewhere
Didn't
else.
we bomb the daylights out of Kosovo in the Clinton administration?
Well, we bombed it.
Mrs. Albright wanted
Yeah,
sort of an American-controlled caliphate.
yeah. Well, that's largely it. You've got to go back to Albright and Al Gore, Sandy Berger, Strobe
Chris.
Talbot. These are all figures in the church of moralizing globalism, and they wanted to create this new paradise. And so we bombed them for 78 days. And of course, this had a hugely negative impact on all the Orthodox Christians that live in the region, because from their standpoint, we're backing an Islamist element in their neighborhood that they personally revile and detest. And we're doing it at the expense of Orthodox Christians. I mean, in that part of the world, you cannot be everyone's friend. If you side with anybody, you become instantly enemies for everybody else.
Of course.
And then we created this mess, and this mess's fault is gradually beginning to unravel.
At the same time that we just the president just authorized another $2.58 billion today in military equipment to be shipped to Ukraine. He has no off-ramp, Colonel.
No, that's
no political off-ramp, no moral off-ramp. He doesn't possess a moral off-ramp. I don't know how this is going to end. What do you see happening in the next 6 months?
Well, remember, from their vantage point, and I'm talking about the people in power in Washington, this includes most of the people who sit in the Senate and the House.
Right.
If you oppose our policy, you are by definition evil. So that anything that we do to you is justified. This is the unfortunate situation. We demonized the Serbs and treated them as though they were all war criminals. We're doing the same thing to the Russians. It's all going to end badly for us. But I think the most likely scenario is financial crisis followed by economic downturn that will drive us out of Ukraine. That's the only way I see us leaving. Unless, of course, some of these governments in Europe turn over. And remember, the situation in Europe, certainly from an economic standpoint, is in many cases much worse. I mean, I've got all these.
I think the governments in France and Germany are very tenuous at this point.
No, I think so. And you could see those governments change. And the average German on the street doesn't want anything to do with the war against Russia in Ukraine. The average German says, why haven't we negotiated an end to this? Why have we behaved as a vassal state for America? I mean, 6 weeks ago, 8 weeks ago, 10 weeks ago, people said, well, we have to be good. Well, I don't know about the leaking bit. Depends on who you talk to. I'm simply saying that based upon my sources in the Department of Defense, people who are close to the senior military leadership tell me that they have made it very clear that choosing to fight Russia in Ukraine would be a serious mistake and should be avoided. That's what they've said. And I think they're being honest about that. And I think they're being truthful for a change. The second part is, are we capable of fighting? Well, of course we're capable of fighting. The real question is, if you're going to fight, will you win? And this is the question that people don't ask enough. This goes back to an old strategic axiom. Measure what you might gain by what you might lose. A collision with Russia would be a loss for us. There's nothing to be gained by it. The Russians have nothing that we need or want. There's no ideological hostility. We're not competing for power or control over any particular region. Russia's dispute is exclusively with Ukraine. We're a large part of the reason why the dispute exists. There's no question about that. But we can end that tomorrow morning if we decide to, by simply saying, we fought long enough. Russia has the upper hand. Zelensky, sit down, shut up, and take notes. We must have a ceasefire, but first we have to agree to negotiations without preconditions.
Does Washington want to fight Russia via a proxy war?
I think they did I think they regret it at this point, to be blunt with you. No one will admit it publicly, but if you go back to the donor conference where Lloyd Austin spoke to the gathered donors from NATO and other nations and said, we have a very short time left, a very short window of time in which to make things happen. And time is running out. I mean, I quoted him in the op-ed piece for that reason. He knows, everyone in Washington in a position of authority now knows Ukraine is losing. Ukrainian resistance is crumbling. The state itself is in danger of going out of existence. That's how bad it is. So the theory is, well, if we can give them anything within the next 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 days, perhaps we can rescue them from disaster. I don't see much evidence for that, but I think that's the theory.
Can Ukraine survive as a country if Putin pursues this war all out, whether for military reasons or for domestic Russian political reasons?
Well, the first thing to keep in mind, and this is something of which I was not aware until I consulted with a friend who's done some excellent demographic analysis. And he points out that at the beginning of this war, there were, at least in theory, 37.5 million Ukrainians in Ukraine. And he makes the point that today that's not the case. There were already 2 million Ukrainians working in either Great Britain or the European Union outside of the country. You now have 4 million Ukrainian citizens, albeit Russians, people who speak Russian, living under Russian occupation or administration right now in the provinces in the south. Then you have over 10 million Ukrainians that have fled the country.
10 million?
10 million.
That's a third of the country, or a quarter of the country.
Yeah, you've got 1 million that have gone into Russia and the rest that have headed west. Now, to this must be added the losses. And again, no one is telling us the truth in the West about the horrific losses that Ukraine has taken. You've heard me say about 157,000 dead on the battlefield. That includes 35,000 missing in action, presumed dead. And I've talked about a total of almost 400,000 casualties, people that are wounded. In most cases, not all, but in most cases, more than half of those will never return to duty because the wounds are too horrific. In other words, they're permanently lost to the Ukrainian fight. Now, supposedly when Zelensky was in town speaking to Secretary Austin and General Milley, several people have insisted that he actually told them that 257,000 Ukrainians have died. That includes soldiers, in other words, those in uniform, civilians, all types, all kinds, 257,000. Well, we don't know. I mean, that's an unconfirmed rumor. But what it does tell you is that today in Ukraine, there are roughly between 18 and 22 million people left in the country under Zelensky's control. Now, Judge, that number is roughly the same as the number of people living in the Netherlands. You cannot sustain this war with that small population. Judge, I'm not hearing you.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Gotcha.
Okay. Apologies.
That's okay.
For watching and listening. Sometimes I'm all thumbs. I want to play a clip from Jack Devine. This is a guy that our audience loves to hate. He is, however, career CIA, and for many years was in charge of American espionage in Russia and monitoring Russian espionage here. Here's Jack Devine betting on a Ukraine win.
I'm betting on the Ukrainians still. It's not to say that the Russians aren't going to be formidable. I do think there will be undertrained. There'll be sometimes when you create something big and it's not well trained, they become cannon fodder. So I think it's going to be a really tough spring, and I think the war in many ways will be decided. There won't be a victor. In other words, the Russians cannot conquer Ukraine, and the Ukrainians are not going to beat the Russians. There's a certain point where both sides pull back. And even if you don't have an agreement, they lower their intensity. And that's when I think Putin personally is in trouble in his own country, and I think he goes. That's why the stakes are so big.
So he's suggesting that this will be over when both sides lower their intensity, and if Putin does that, quote, he goes. because that will not be interpreted as a victory for the Russian nationalists. Your comments on that, Colonel?
Well, remember, the CIA has been telling us lies almost from the very beginning about everything happening in Russia.
Well,
and
when
about
Mike Pompeo was running the CIA, he publicly acknowledged that's their job, to lie to us. So how do you know whether to believe them or not?
Well, they do a very good job of lying. The problem is they're lying to Americans, and this man, Devine, knows absolutely nothing about Russians. I don't care what his job was, or about Ukrainians or the Slavic peoples that occupy Eastern Europe. The Russians are winning. Ukraine is crumbling. Ukraine's on the verge of collapse. We're going to watch that happen over the next several weeks. The Russians will crush out of existence what remains of the Ukrainian armed forces, and I think they'll have to go after this regime, assuming Zelensky and his friends don't rapidly flee the country to Poland or somewhere else. Now, having said that, the Russians are being very methodical, very deliberate. They are moving constantly, but they are not moving on multiple axes simultaneously. In other words, you're not going to see the blitzkrieg. What you're going to see on several axes are what I would call large meat grinders that are just systematically plowing forward, annihilating everything that they come in touch with that is Ukrainian until the Ukrainians are finished. There is no incentive for them at this point to negotiate with us unless we go in without conditions. Would the Russians prefer not to annihilate everything in Ukraine? Yes. They never went in there with that goal to begin with. But you can't walk in there and say, well, the only way we'll talk to you is if you withdraw all your forces from Ukraine and Crimea. That's absurd.
So really what you're saying is there's no way that Ukraine, and I'm paraphrasing you from the column, which I mentioned earlier, there's no way Ukraine can survive this war as an intact country.
Listen, I just told you what the demographics say. And what's even worse is that Ukraine has the lowest birth rate in Europe.
Oh.
So in addition to having lost millions of people because frankly, people like Devine and his masters have decided to wage this war on the backs of Ukraine. Ukraine is destroyed. I don't know what survives of it. I have no idea what will happen.
Even though I am your friend and admirer, and at times your student, let me raise your blood pressure one more time with Jack Devine on a weakened Russia.
Do we want a strong Russia with Putin and Xi? Is that going to bring us peace and harmony so we can live in isolation? I think Putin today he crossed. I'm on record in the Washington Post in March last year, a few days after he invaded. He sowed the seed of his own demise. That is actually good news for us. Whoever causes it, that's a good news. A weak Russia that sees Putin going weakens China as well as Russia.
Does that make sense to you?
Again, I think the man's delusional. Putin has never been stronger than he is today. The Russian people have never been more united than they are today. Only someone who's never spent any time in the country and doesn't know anybody over there would make such preposterous statements. This is part of the larger false narrative. Look, he reminds me of some of the Germans that stood around in Berlin in 1945 and asked, what about the inevitable victory? What's wrong? What's happened? Because the regime over the previous 6 to 12 months had lied so consistently and effectively that the Germans were surprised to see Russian and American troops on the outskirts of the city. I think all I can tell you is that no, he's dead wrong. Now let's talk about this weakened Russia business. It's not weakened. The IMF has now stepped forward and talked about growth in Russia dramatically improving. Their exports are way up. None of this nonsense that we anticipated that was bad has happened to Russia. Russia's in a very strong and healthy position. We, on the other hand, our growth is declining, and it's not going to get better in the near term. Secondly, Russia is a state with an important role in Central Asia and Eastern Europe. If Russia were to be destroyed, which is not going to happen, if it were to weaken, it would open up opportunities for all sorts of potentially malicious actors to intervene. First of all, Eastern Siberia is not of much interest to the Chinese, contrary to popular belief, but it's very interesting to Japan and Korea. And the Japanese and the Koreans view Eastern Siberia as their territory because up until about 300 years ago, Mongols, Turkic peoples, Tartars, they were the only people in the region, and they're brothers of the Manchus, Mongols, and Japanese and Koreans. So do you really want Russia to collapse in Eastern Siberia? I don't think so. You go into Central Asia, Russia is a stabilizing factor there. In fact, Xi depends upon Russia to help stabilize it because the people in Central Asia have much more confidence and trust in the Russians than they do in the Chinese.
How unified is NATO behind Washington? I'm going to play a clip. Yeah, right. I'm going to play a clip for you in a minute from the president of Croatia. It's not Germany. It's not France. It's Croatia. But the language is very strident, and the criticisms of the West are very strong and articulate. Take a listen.
Ali ja nisam predsjednik Ukrajine.
Ako se Ukrajina želi braniti, trebali je pomoći.
Razdragani pacifisti u cvjetnim haljenicama odjednom bi se napili krvi nekome, ali ne oni, nego preko tuđe grbače. Ovo je u određenoj mjeri duboko nemoralno što radimo kao kolektivni zapad koji u biti ne postoji, jer tu nema rješenja. Rješenje nije promjena vlasti u Rusiji. Dapače, njemački tenkovi u Harkovu će dodatno homogenizirati Ruse. Politički će ih homogenizirati. Zbližit će ih sa Kinezima. To se događa.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. The West is not united. You've been saying that. The tanks coming from Germany, he didn't mention the American tanks. The tanks coming from Germany will only gin up the Russians to fight more aggressively. It's in nobody's interest to weaken Russia. And he's a member of NATO.
Of course. Two things. Nassim Taleb often talks about finance, and he talks about people at the top who don't have skin in the game. Our problem in Washington, D.C., and in many capitals in Europe right now is that they're perfectly happy to fight this war until Ukraine ceases to exist, and 1 million Ukrainians are dead because they have no skin in the game. They haven't put themselves at risk, nor will they do so. And that's disgraceful, and he's talking about that to some extent. And then secondly, it's interesting this man is a Croat because, you know, the Croatians, like most Europeans, to be perfectly blunt, that people don't like to admit, were part of the crusade to destroy Bolshevism during World War II. But he knows that Russia is not a communist state. He knows Russia does not aspire to conquer Europe. The Russians learned the hard way that imperialism is a very bad form of government and business. When you move into countries that are not yours and you have to govern and sustain people that are not yours, inevitably there's bad blood, there's anger, there's corruption. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who probably more than anyone else inspires the Russians who are at the top today, made it very clear we should all be grateful that this horrible empire that existed is gone. We don't want to govern other people. We want to govern ourselves. We want our own country, this place called Russia. And that is the way the Russians think right now. They're not interested in conquering anything, but we are making it impossible for them to turn away because we make threat after threat after threat to dismember the country, to destroy its regime. And we keep talking about it as though this is something the Russians want. They do not want that.
After decades of German political leaders disarming Germany and depriving Berlin of its credibility, I'm quoting your article, Chancellor Scholz decides to send tanks. Is this to please Joe Biden? Because he's not going to please anybody his domestic political forces, is he?
He'll please some people in Germany, a minority, I would suspect. The majority, I think, are somewhat horrified because the Germans, based on their experience, and they also know their own history, know that when Berlin and Moscow have cooperated and done business together, there has been peace in Europe. You know, if there's any one war in human history that made absolutely no sense, it was the war between Tsarist Russia and Imperial Germany. They had been close allies and friends for hundreds of years. There was no reason for that to happen. It did. The Second World War, we know the background on that. It was a huge tragedy. Everyone decided in 1945, who was German, this will not happen again. We will not permit it. I cannot imagine Chancellor Kohl or Chancellor Schmidt, Helmut Schmidt, that some of your viewers may remember, standing up and urging equipment be sent to this corrupt gangster regime in Kyiv that's killing off its own people with these stupid instructions that are given to their generals in the field with a military structure that is corrupt and celebrating it. On the contrary, I think they would have said absolutely not, out of the question. This man, Scholz, is not going to last long. And if anything, what we're seeing now, even though it is not patently obvious, is the beginning of the end of NATO.
So, Colonel, big picture, here's my head scratcher. If the West, if the leading countries economically in NATO, the United States, Germany, Great Britain, France, want to wage this war against Russia, if Tony Blinken and his globalist buddies in the foreign ministries in Western Europe really think that they can use the war to push Putin out or weaken him, if Jack Devine and the CIA, or if Jack is actually articulating what the CIA is trying to accomplish, why is the Western military response so tepid? I mean, you can't fight the Russians with just a half dozen tanks, and you can't fight them at all with tanks that aren't going to get there for another 4 or 5 or 6 months. And American troops in Poland are not going to keep Putin up at night.
We have 100,000 troops in Europe. And of that number, I'd be surprised if we have 40 or 50,000 combat troops. That means the soldiers, sergeants, lieutenants, captains who actually go in and shoot people. In other words, most of that is still support. And we don't have that much artillery. We don't have that much in the way of immediate indirect fire support. We're in no position to do it. We could bring in more Poles. They can bring in a couple of 100,000 Poles to fight, but they're not going to be adequately armed to take on the Russians, and they're not going to be adequately trained. So it's sheer lunacy. But again, you've got to go back and understand how this began. At the beginning, Putin sent in a very small force and gave them very specific instructions that they were not to kill civilians, they were not to damage infrastructure, because he was simply trying to demonstrate the seriousness with which Russia viewed what we were doing in eastern Ukraine by building up this dangerous force against them. Well, it took 2-3 months. He finally figured out no one is going to negotiate with us. No one cares to. In the meantime, we reached the erroneous conclusion that, see, look, the Russians are weak. The Russians can't cope. The Russians are no threat. We can beat them. Well, that was the wrong conclusion. And what we're seeing happen right now is a massive expansion of Russian military power on a scale that we have not seen since the Cold War. And this is going to be a permanent expansion, a large and powerful force. The 700,000 plus that are around Ukraine right now are a brand new force, a brand new army. This thing is poised to do one thing: annihilate whatever is in its path. It will do that. However, again, the Russians are being methodical. They're being cautious because they do worry that we are led by impulsive, erratic personalities in Washington. And that stupidly, when we realize that the place is falling apart, I mean Ukraine, someone will say, well, we have to do something. I don't know how many times while I was on active duty, I heard people at the top of the political structure say, well, we have to do something. As soon as they say that,
right,
leave the room.
Right.
Get the hell out of there.
I mean, this is a favorite government line. They have to give the impression to the public that they're doing something, even if it's 180 degrees from what they're doing. But the West, whether it's Chancellor Scholz or President Biden, or to a lesser extent, the new Prime Minister of Great Britain, is like a boxer punching with his left hand and then apologizing to the gallery with his right for hitting too hard. What are they accomplishing?
Scholz is doing what he's done throughout his career. Remember that Scholz and others have grown up over the last 30 or 40 years in this environment where there was very little change. And their formative period of experience came after the Cold War ended. And they saw a very different world. And they became, I think, enamored of this notion that the United States is the hegemon of the world, and that whatever we do is right, and anybody who resists us is morally wrong. They've taken this position, and this justifies all sorts of dangerous behavior. I don't think that Mr. Scholz is going to last much longer. I certainly don't think his foreign minister will. These people are out of touch with reality. No competent German statesman over the last 300 or 400 years would have made the stupid remarks and statements that they have.
Didn't he just lose his defense minister about 2 weeks ago?
Well, we haven't had much of it in the way of defense ministers in that country now for at least 20 years. I mean, when we went to Desert Storm in 1991, arguably the Germans had the finest forces in NATO. I mean, they were top notch, and they remained excellent through the mid 1990s. And then a series of leftist governments systematically dismantled them. This is after Chancellor Kohl left. Now, on the one hand, they took the position that Russia was not a threat, and it is not a military threat to them unless they make it so. And that was understandable, but they lost sight of the fact that if you have no skin in the game, as I said earlier, when it comes to military power, nobody's going to pay attention to you. I mean, the Polish army could invade Germany tomorrow morning and conquer it in a week.
Ooh, well, that's the line of this
True.
this interview. Colonel, always a pleasure, sir. Thank you very much for joining us.
Okay, thank you. By the way, can I add one thing that a lot of our people don't seem to understand about these tanks?
Please.
We promised 31 M1 series tanks. They have to be built from scratch. And people have said, well, why is that? Well, it's very simple. We have a form of armor protection on the existing M1 series tanks that is some of the very best in the world, if not the best. That was developed over many years. It's a very complex composite form of armor. We will not allow tanks with that unique armor to fall into the hands of the Russians. And we have to assume, based upon the Ukrainians that have lost, we estimate 7,000 vehicles, including at least a couple of thousand tanks and 2,000 or 3,000 other armored vehicles that have either been destroyed or fell into the hands of the Russians. We have to assume that these could. So the decision was made to build 31 M1 series tanks, but apply the 1970s armor to them. So that if they fell into the hands of the opponent, it would not be a security risk for us. We would not lose this advantage that we have. But there's something larger here.